This video is about the Heath family. Think heath, you might think of the English countryside or something like that, but a lot of these are probably pretty familiar plants to you, like the rhododendron. Here's a white rhododendron. These are usually glossy, simple-leaved plants, often shrubs, but not always. Many of them are evergreen, and they have these cute little white or pink flowers. Sometimes they're large and showy, other times they're just small and bell-shaped. There's quite a few examples that you may look somewhat familiar to you, but a pretty wide-ranging family that we'll explore in this video. In terms of the plant kingdom, they're here in the eudicot group, or just dicots, so they are a flowering plant. You would know that you have something in the Ericaceae or Heath family if it's a shrub, although not 100% on that one. Not all of them are. Their leaves very often are evergreen, like I said, simple and glossy, usually that elliptical shape, just something roughly like this, a kind of plain looking leaf. Flowers are usually white or pink, and they often are fused into these sort of bell-shaped flowers like these guys over here on pine sap, often in a tube, but not always. You'll usually find these guys in the forests in Washington State, chaparral in the few areas where that exists. And then there's these non-green species. These down here like pine sap, which I showed you the flowers of here. They're a little confusing. They don't fit any of the rest of those characteristics, but they are really interesting to think about and to study. So we'll take a look at those too. So you have a plant and you think it's part of the Heath family, but you're not quite sure. What should you make sure you look at? Well, whether it's an herb or a shrub is important. The specifics of the leaves, of course. Any details about the flower arrangement, and definitely anything about the fruit. The type of fruit, the color of the fruit, anything else that you might note about that is going to help you out. Now the first genus that we'll look at, Vaccinium, is blueberries and huckleberries. That's probably a pretty familiar one to you. Maybe you've gone out blueberry or huckleberry picking, whether at a farm locally or out in the mountains. So these are shrubs, and as you can tell here from this kind of bleak photograph in the fall, they are deciduous, so these nice glossy green leaves, they lose in the fall. The shrubs grow about waist high on these usually kind of reddish stems, and later in the summer produce red to dark bluish black berries. Now the difference between those and whether it's a blueberry or a huckleberry seems to be largely a matter of opinion. I'm not going to add my opinion to the mix, but they're all worth tasting. Some are better than others. Everyone has their favorites. The flowers, which I don't have pictured here, look similar to the others in the family. A lot of times you'll hear them called urn-shaped, so they look cute, usually whitish yellow. They have little petals down here at the base, and I think they look a lot like hot air balloons, but a lot of times you'll see them referred to as urn-shaped. On blueberries, these are usually kind of yellowish white, often tinged with pink. They hang down like that, and the bees will get in there and fight their way in to pollinate them. So that's the blueberries and the huckleberries. There are some smaller members of these that are down at the ground level. So those were waist high. These are kind of shin high, maybe even smaller. These are grouseberries and whortleberries. Kind of fun to say. They are delicious little berries, but they are tiny. It would take a very long time to make a whortleberry pie. But these are still members of the same family. Here's those flowers I was talking about just a minute ago. Look like little short hot air balloons to me. Pretty inconspicuous on these small plants. These guys produce red berries, and you can see even here at the end the remnant of the flower petals. So these are an inferior ovary plant, if that helps you identify them. So our next member of the Heath family is Kinnikinnick, which is part of this group in the genus Arctostaphylos, which also includes a bunch of relatives down south called manzanitas. You might recognize that the name means little apple, which you can see from their fruits why they might be called that. And they even taste like little apples. They're really important food source for humans, bears, birds, you name it. Later in the summer when they produce those berries, they are an important food source. Although I find Kinnikinnick to not be a particularly tasty one, but the other manzanitas are. All the manzanitas and even the madrone have this really glossy red smooth bark that's pretty distinctive. That combined with these glossy evergreen, just ovate leathery leaves really tell you that you have a manzanita. Some of the manzanitas are a little tricky to tell apart, but Kinnikinnick is a pretty easy one. So it's this really low to the ground, mat forming shrub. It is a woody plant. It's evergreen. It grows up in the forest, usually in some openings and rocky soils. So you'll find this one kind of low to mid elevations. Does really well, even in a pretty harsh, dry environment, and just gets buried by snow all winter and comes back out and is active again in the summer. It blooms just about early as it possibly can. In the spring, it has these cute little bell-shaped flowers, or urn-shaped, however you want to call them, usually white with a tinge of pink, and that's what results in those nice little berries. There's a pretty closely related species in Washington State called pine mat that you see pictured up here in the upper right. At least I'm fairly certain that's pine mat. Slightly taller shrubs, but there you go. Kinnikinnick and pine mat. The western teaberry, I partly include this one just to give you a good sense of the family. So again, you notice this shrub down here, really small shrub, low to the ground, glossy, green, evergreen leaves, fairly distinctive. Even its flowers look a little less closed, a little more bell-like and less hot air balloon-like than the manzanitas and Kinnikinnick, but there they are. And its fruits, those little kind of dryish, mealy berries, tiny and hidden from view. You kind of got to get down on your hands and knees to appreciate this one. But it is related to another plant that you may be more familiar with, which is salal, which you find growing really commonly on the west side. And even if you don't go over there, you may see it in flower arrangements over here. So salal is a very similar looking plant, although usually kind of a good 6 feet tall with larger leaves. Another plant you'll see up in the forest, especially as you get higher in elevation, are the heathers. Once you start hearing the Clark's nutcrackers and picas, then look around in the rocks and you'll probably see these plants. There's a couple different types of them that I won't go into the details on, but both of them are named after kind of Greek mythological sprightly figures, which kind of suits their playful little flowers really nicely. However, these are tough plants. These grow up under mountains of snow in really harsh conditions among the rocks. So they're not to be trifled with. They're not sprightly little plants. They have smaller leaves, which helps them survive in these kind of dry environments in the summer. But again, leathery, deep green, evergreen. You can see it in both of these cases. That kind of gives it away for this family. However, instead of the nice red berries like we had on Kinnikinnick, these guys have these kind of unexciting dry capsules with several seeds in them. So those are a couple of the heathers. You're probably familiar with rhododendrons, really common garden plant, and native to Washington State, although many of the really showy ones come from the west side of the state where it's a lot wetter. On the east side, the only rhododendron we have is the white rhododendron. You can see the white flowers here. This one a little past its prime, but nonetheless a typical rhododendron flower. Blooms around July once the snows have finally melted off from the mountain environments. They have these glossy green leaves, somewhat leathery, but these guys are deciduous. They're not evergreen. But here on this bottom picture, you see how glossy they are. This one is also called mountain misery. It's kind of a graceful shrub as you see it over here, but it lives in these really snowy environments. And as the snow packs it down, these long, flexible stems bend downward under the snow. And so they kind of get bent downhill. Then they curve back up. And they form these really just vast thickets that are a little over head high. So they make it kind of hard to see. And the way that they're bent makes it really difficult to get through. So mountain misery, I don't know if it's quite misery, but they can get kind of annoying if you're trying to kind of get off trail a little bit. So there's the white rhododendron, another important member of the Heath family. All right, these next plants are a little different. So starting with Pipsissewa, we see a lot of the resemblance to the rest of the Heath family. You see these glossy, leathery, deep green leaves. So that's pretty common and familiar. It's shrubby, but just barely shrubby. I mean, the very base is woody, but not particularly so. But these plants don't get much more than about a foot high, so they're fairly small, not the shrubs we've been dealing with up till date. The name Pipsissewa actually comes from a Cree word, which means breaks into little pieces. When you look at the fruits, these dry capsules, they break into all these tiny little fragments, like orange slices, somewhat. This is an interesting plant. A lot of people think, I don't know if it's been established, that it's a partial root parasite. So it gets some of its nutrition from other plants that it steals through its roots underground. You find it growing, like you can see here on this picture on the left, in really shady environments in the forest. And so maybe that's how it gets by stealing a little extra nutrition from other plants around it, because it lacks some of the sunlight that it needs. The flowers, I think, are really highly unusual. They're not the little bells or urns or hot air balloons we've been looking at so far. They look more like a little cup and saucer with this little fringe of anthers. All in all, just a really interesting plant. So Pipsissewa, or sometimes called prince's pine, an unusual little plant in this family. Right beside Pipsissewa, you wouldn't be too surprised to find a bunch of wintergreen plants. And there's a couple of them, but here's pink wintergreen, is called by the pink flowers, which don't look really much like anything in this family at all. They're not those cute little bell shape or urn shape or anything like that. They're just their own thing. Maybe a little bit like Pipsissewa, but then they have this weird, looks like an elephant trunk coming down here, this long style coming down, waiting to catch some pollen. Beautiful little plants. You can tell they're part of this family and that they have these glossy, deep green, sort of leathery leaves. And they are evergreen, thus the name wintergreen. So they're called that because they're green in the winter, not because they taste like wintergreen. So don't chew a leaf and expect it to taste like gum. However, these guys are not woody like the rest of the family. They have just really perennial rootstocks that produce leaves in this basal rosette, and once in a while shoot up this flowering stalk kind of midsummer. So there's the wintergreen plant. You will find these guys deep in the forest, usually in shady locations, and always with a lot of organic matter, lots of pine duff, rotten pine needles, etc. that's built up. And part of that helps to feed all the fungi in the soil. So there's lots of fungi in the soil. The fungi feed the plant, and the plant gives some back to the fungi as well. Now that relationship is taken to the next level by this next plant, the Pinedrops. This is a very bizarre looking plant. When you see it, you think, where's the rest of it? A lot of times you'll go into the forest and you'll see it just sitting here, just like this long red stalk. And there's a couple others like this as well, like Indian pipe and candy stick. But I'll just use Pinedrops as our example. You look at that and you look at the flowers and you think, okay, I can see the resemblance here. That looks a lot like blueberry flowers. But where did this come from? Where's the rest of the plant? I mean, you just think, where is the green? It's got to be there somewhere. You think maybe somebody's playing a trick on you. They just stuck a flowering stalk in the ground. But that's it. And these guys, like the others, the wintergreens, will steal their food from the fungus, but instead of giving back, they just keep taking, it seems. So they've got to have a lot of organic matter in the soil to feed the fungi that they then steal the energy from themselves. So here's one just coming up. It's using all that energy from the fungus to put up its flowering stalk, and there it is in full flower. And then afterward, these turn into these little kind of round, dry fruits with little splits in them. And they'll just stay there for sometimes 2 or 3 years, just sitting there upright in the soil. And it's kind of a strange mystery. You think, what is this doing here? Where is the rest of the plant? But that's pine drops, and there's several of those in this family. Now, all of the members of the Heath family actually form important associations with fungi and their roots. So there's this kind of symbiotic relationship where both of them are helping one another. It just seems like with a few of the members of the family, they've kind of gone rogue and don't give back to the fungus. But they're getting away with it, so there they are. Well, that's it for this episode of the Heath family. I hope that introduces you to more of the interesting plants that you'll often see, especially out in the forest this time. Until next time, happy botanizing and have a great hike.